Episode 2 Granny's House.
First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my story. It's somewhat unbelievable and all about the strange events I witnessed during a trip to my granny's house. Events that left me scared to my core. So I'll start by saying who I am, as I do feel it's relevant. My name is Orlaith and I was brought up in Dublin, Ireland. For the most part, I was just a normal girl in a normal city living a normal life. At the time of these events, it was the mid-80s, when I was around about 17 in age. One thing you should know is that Ireland is perhaps a little more open to the ideas of folklore and mysticism than most. Where I lived in Dublin, less so, but certain parts of the country, the beliefs are very much widely held. Our country has a rich history in all sorts of lore such as fairies, the banshee, and any number of superstitions. I'm telling you this for context, as it may help you understand my experience a little better. It was late autumn. I'd been asked by my mother to go and stay with my grandmother on the west coast of the country just for a few weeks. Granny was in her 80s and suffering from rheumatism, arthritis, and her sight also was not so good in her old age. I was there to help out a bit before the deep of winter set in. I didn't see Granny too often, with her being way out west. She lived in an incredibly isolated location, even for Ireland. She lived in a traditional old stone cottage. Water was gathered from the well, as there was no running water. The only heat sources were wood to burn on the open fire and the oil heater. The place was completely off-grid, so she was reliant on the quarterly visits to top up the oil. Most food she grew herself in the back garden, although once a month there was a service from the nearby village shop to deliver the additional supplies. My cousin Seamus would often make the round trip in his 4x4. To access the property there was little more than a dirt track. In some places it was just slightly worn grass. There was a lot of open heathland nearby and also an ancient forest. The place was absolutely beautiful and like stepping back in time. I had brought some books with me as well as my Walkman and quite a few packs of spare batteries. I'd only previously visited when I was a young child. Mum had reminded me to take any creature comforts I needed though. I remember the house well. It was small yet functional and incredibly picturesque. The fact that nothing else was around just made it even more special. There was a stone wall in what you could perhaps call the front garden, although there was no clear definition as to where the property lines actually extended to. With nobody residing anywhere near, there really was no need. I pulled up one afternoon after the drive in my car. It barely made it up the hillside, as I seem to remember. I knocked on the stone cottage door several times before Granny came. I assumed that either her hearing wasn't very good or she was simply slow on her feet. She was very much as I remember her, although quite a bit older. Granny was best described as a kind little old lady, very traditional as I recall. She put a copper kettle on the fireplace and served me tea and homemade bread. I remember it being cosy in the cottage, with the evening drawing in, the fireplace giving off a friendly glow and heat. I chatted with Granny for some time. She seemed genuinely pleased of the company, as it had been some time I guess. Due to her rheumatism, she slept in the living room downstairs. That way she was close to the warmth of the fire in winter and needn't use the stairs. She explained to me that there was a bedroom for me upstairs. I just had to take the bedding up. It was very different to my room in Dublin. It wasn't unpleasant, it was just very basic. Just a simple bed, a chair and a chest of drawers with a mirror on it. It all needed a good clean, but that could wait. It was clear that it hadn't been used in quite some time. I don't think I had any particular fear at this point, but I certainly remember feeling a little bit uneasy. In the daytime, the isolation seemed charming. By night, any noise from the wind or local wildlife put me on edge. I definitely didn't sleep well that first night. Over the next few days, I helped Granny tidy and dust the house, as well as help out in the garden. There was a lot of weeding to be done, but I actually quite enjoyed it. So here's where things get a bit weird. I was in the back garden turning over the soil and pulling up some weeds when my hand stumbled across an old hair comb. It just seemed out of place. I washed it off in a bucket nearby. It had an expensive looking dark wooden handle, and the comb teeth themselves appeared to be carved from some sort of bone. I didn't think too much to it, or attribute much significance. I just assumed Granny had dropped it at some point in time. I remember washing it off a little better and leaving it on the nightstand in my room after I came in that evening. Granny had been preparing a broth of various root vegetables that I'd harvested that day. I had set a small amount out in the small stone pantry that connected to the main cottage. As our conversation wound up for the evening, I left Granny downstairs. By night, the cottage took on an eerie feel. It seemed to give me a chill as I slowly ascended the wooden stairs. They were over 100 years old, so creaked dramatically. I placed the candle by my bed and started to undress. It was cold, so I remember wanting to get under the sheets very quickly. I took out my earrings to put them on the nightstand. That's when I noticed that the bone comb was lying on the floor, not on the stand where I was certain that I had left it. I picked it up and placed it back. I put it down to me having perhaps knocked it off myself at some point, although I hadn't been aware. That night I slept very badly. There was a wind outside that rattled the old panes. I could actually feel the cold wind on my skin due to the age of the cottage and gaps in the window fittings. I dozed off at some point, but was woken by what sounded like a crying of some kind. It was a woman's cry. It was a sort of sobbing that you would hear at a funeral, almost uncontrollable. It was very distinct. Naturally, I picked up the candle to go check on Granny. Down the dark stairs, and I stood in the corner of the living room. By my candle and the dying fire, I could see that she was fast asleep. I went back upstairs to my room and convinced myself it was simply the wind or a vixen crying in the darkness. I was, however, very unnerved by the experience. I did ask Granny about it the next day. She sort of brushed it off, but also gave some cautionary advice. She told me not to follow any voices or respond to any figures that might appear on the hill. As you can imagine, this freaked me out a little bit. Granny hadn't flat out denied that there may be a voice or even figures. I remember her saying, "You leave them alone and they'll leave you alone." Granny, living in the West Country, was of an older generation and took local law and legends very seriously, as did a lot of people in the area. It didn't exactly put me at ease. This is where things started to really escalate. Later that day, I went back up to my room to relax for a while. I was on top of the bed listening to my music on my Walkman. I must have closed my eyes for a bit just to catch up on some lost sleep. To my utter shock, I noticed that the comb was once more lying on the floor in front of the dressing table. Now I know I hadn't done this. This couldn't have been the wind or an accident. Someone had done this. But it couldn't have been Granny. Trust me when I say she wasn't physically capable of getting upstairs. She would have had to crawl, and even then I don't think it either likely or possible, certainly not getting down again. That night I couldn't sleep. In the corner of my eye, I thought that I could see a dark figure hunkered in the corner of the room. My blood ran cold as I stared at it. Yet again the wind was blowing and the room seemed alive. It didn't feel as if I was alone. I clung to my sheets as I stared at the black mass. My brain was desperately trying to process what it was. It turned the image over and over again until it settled on the form of an old lady, hunched and dressed in a black shawl. From nowhere, an ear-piercing wailing began. It froze me to the bed. It seemed to penetrate and paralyse my body. I thought that the black entity would come towards me. Instead, it simply blended away after some time to leave the corner empty again. That's the best I can describe it. I was left physically and emotionally shattered. The following day, I was troubled. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I could glimpse the outline of a shadowy figure on the hill against the grey skyline. I brought the subject back up with Granny as we lit candles throughout the cottage. By afternoon, the sky was darkening and clear that a storm would be upon us that night. I questioned her hard this time. Had she ever seen anything? Reluctantly, she told me in her belief that the long departed did roam the hillside. The old lady in the dark shawl, though, she believed was a type of banshee, a sort of spirit whose wail heralds an upcoming death. Being more of a city girl, I still didn't know what to believe. But I know what I had experienced. I was a believer enough, though, to do as Granny said and leave things be, just in case. By late evening, the hillside where the cottage stood was black with rain clouds. Granny had got into her living room bed to ride out the storm. I had done the rounds, ensuring that extra candles were placed around the rooms, and that the fireplace was stocked extra high before going upstairs. Before getting into bed, I made an extra effort to check that the comb was still on the dressing table. It was. I vividly remember then hiding under the blanket in the near darkness of the room. The wind from outside continued to rip and howl around the building, sounding very much like the legendary banshee. The howling lasted for what seemed like an eternity, until it was just a howl. It was a howl of grief. I looked towards the corner. To my horror, once more, the figure in black was hunched there, and it was looking at me. It was sort of the absence of a person, rather than an actual person itself. It's hard to describe. As if the energy of a person was there, but also not fully there in physical form. This time, the wailing intensified as my eyes were transfixed on the figure. Little by little, it began to move towards me at a slow pace. It reached the end of the bed, and then sat on top of me. I couldn't move. I couldn't call for help. It was as if the air was being sucked out of me. Its face got closer as it screamed. I must have passed out due to the fear. It was the single most terrifying thing I have ever had happen to me. The next morning I was still shaking. The morning light did nothing to calm my nerves. Once I saw the comb on the floor again, I knew that I had not imagined the horrors of the night. I remember picking up the comb and taking it downstairs. I wanted to talk to Granny and tell her all about the night. I was so scared I told her that I simply couldn't stay after that. I don't think I even stayed for breakfast that morning. I simply put the comb in Granny's handbag by the stairs, hugged her, and left. It sounds so cowardly telling you this now, but that is what happened. You know when you watch those horror movies and for some reason the girl stays in the haunted house? Yeah, that wasn't going to be me. Hopefully that's enough to convince you that I am telling the truth. I knowingly abandoned my grandma on the basis that her house was haunted. I left that morning and drove all the way back to Dublin that day. At each rest stop I remember looking around me for any visions of dark figures, but there were none. As the locations became more populated, the easier I felt. I would, however, have to explain to my mum why I was home. I told her everything and that Granny had understood. Within a week, my mum broke some bad news to me. Granny had died in the cottage. Cousin Seamus had found her in bed in the living room during one of his supply trips. Her last will and testament was a simple one, with everything left to my mum. Seamus was put in charge of affairs at the house. Part of his job was to gather her belongings. Granny always had her handbag with her in public, so he naturally decided to make sure if there was anything important inside, like rings or a photograph that she may like to have been buried with. To this day, he swears that there was no hair comb in that bag.
If you enjoyed this week's paranormal story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. Until next time, my friends, happy hauntings.